This is ODAT Chat, your instant connection to recovery and community, one day at a time. This podcast may contain strong language, sexual content, and spiritual truth. Listener discretion is advised.
Hi friend, welcome to another episode of the ODAT Chat podcast. My name is Arlena and I'll be your host. If you haven't yet, don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, or you can get new episodes delivered right to your inbox by signing up for the newsletter at odatchat.com. If you're new here, this is a podcast where my guests and I talk about how to recover from alcoholism and addictions, many kinds. We typically spend the first half of the podcast on the backstory, but the magic is really in the solution, so that's what we really try to focus on. I'm looking to uncover the moments of clarity, the revelations, and the tools and practices for healing which lead to long-term recovery. This episode is sponsored by my free 7-day Connection Cure Challenge, how to attract your tribe and overcome isolation. So if you've ever struggled with isolation, then you absolutely need to take this 7-day challenge and experience the relief that comes from feeling supported and connected. You can sign up for free at soberlifeschool.com. So on the podcast today, I'm speaking with my new friend, Susanne Navas. You know, sometimes you meet people and think, wow, how can someone so calm be so powerful? And well, that's Susanne. She has completed multiple Ironman races. She coaches other people to do marathons. She's a life coach, a yoga instructor, and a self-described mindfulpreneur, all while raising 3 kids and being married. And she's also speaking at this year's She Recovers event in LA in September. She's absolutely amazing. So we chat about her childhood for about the first 20 minutes before we even get to her struggles with alcohol, because she had such a unique experience growing up, spending part of her high school years growing up in Mexico, actually. It was really interesting. So we spent a little time there. So if you want to just hear about the struggles with alcohol, that starts about 20 minutes in. But in this conversation, she also shares how some of her friends were parents of children who died in the Sandy Hook shooting, and how some of them were able to cope with such a tragic loss. I also want to encourage you to listen to the end for what I call her evidence of God story. So just by chance, we stumble into this story that was so powerful. It touched my heart and brought me to tears twice. The first time when I heard it, and then again when I was editing the podcast. It was one of those stories that makes your faith just a little bit deeper and heals your heart just a little bit more. So I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. So with that, please enjoy this episode with Susanne. Well, Susanne, welcome to the ODAT Chat podcast.
Thank you so much, Arlena. So fun to be here.
Yeah, we have a mutual friend, and we're both going to, I found out you were going to She Recovers, the event in September. So I was like, hey, we need to chat and be friends and have fun at this event. So thank you so much for being willing to play along and come on the podcast, and it should be a lot of fun.
Oh, it's my honor, and I'm so excited to meet you in person in September. I love listening to all of your podcasts. The episodes are really fantastic, and I often share them. So it'd be so fun to meet you in person.
Oh, yay. That's awesome. I love hearing that. Yeah, we're in like 38 countries now. So you're going to be broadcast around the world. And yeah, it's actually growing and it's super fun. And yeah, I really appreciate you participating. So what I thought we would do is typically I start out, actually I didn't tell you this, I typically start out asking people to sort of describe themselves so the people listening can kind of get an image in their mind of who's talking. So the rudest question in the world, how old are you and what do you look like?
Actually, that's not the rudest. It would have been ruder to ask me how much I weigh, so thank you.
That was my next question. No, I'm just kidding. I won't ask.
Oh, too funny. I don't even know. But yeah, so I'll be 49 in October, which is not too far away. So I'm 48 years old. I'm a mom, I have blonde hair, blue eyes. I'm pretty athletic. And right now I am way too tan from spending too much time in the sun. So working out, not sunbathing.
Right, right. So
Yeah,
you mentioned to me that you do half marathons with your father, who's in his 70s. Is that right?
yeah, so we walk them now. My dad has done something like 25 marathons, but I think
Wow.
the last 8 maybe he walked them. And then when he turned 75, so I started doing one with him every year down in Myrtle Beach, which is where he lives. And so it was really fun. We would walk the full marathon, which it takes between 6.5 to 7 hours. And I have to tell you that walking a marathon is so much harder than running one. So,
Is that
because it
right?
just takes so darn long
Oh,
and it's harder on your hips. And
wow.
so when he decided to downgrade to a half marathon, I was very happy about that. But yeah, on my own, I typically run.
Oh, okay. You're a runner. Do you do other forms of
Yeah.
exercise as well, or is running your favorite?
Running is probably my favorite because it's so low maintenance, and I prefer anything low maintenance. Just basically go out your door wherever you are and run. But I'm a triathlete.
Oh, wow.
I didn't intend this in the first time I did a triathlon. I had no desire to do anything longer than the sprint distance, which is the shorter one. But I did end up, for my 40th birthday, I gave myself the privilege of doing an Ironman. And then when I did
Whoa.
that, I know. And then after doing that, my sister and my dad were like, "That is so awesome. We want to see you do one. Can you do it again?" So I signed up and did it again the following year. And this
We
time
want
they
to
all
see you.
came. Yeah.
And for them, that means
Yeah.
they
So I do
stand in a
that.
spot and you run by. So they see you for what, 10 seconds?
Well, actually, I think they had the harder job because it was in Cozumel in Mexico.
Oh,
So
uh-huh.
it's a 2.4 mile swim, and then the bike is 112 miles, and it's such a small island that you end up having to do 3
Oh,
times
wow.
around the island. And so they had all the kids, and this was a few years ago, so they were much younger. So they were all in a van, and my husband had brought his laptop and was tracking me because he had rented. This is before
Oh
like
my
all these
God.
fancy gadgets we
Apps
have
and
now.
stuff,
So
yeah.
he was tracking me. So they basically went all over the island trying to find me, and it was pretty crazy for them.
Wow, that sounds
So,
intense.
but it was an amazing adventure. It was so much fun. The kids still talk about it.
Oh, wow, that's incredible. How many kids do you have?
Oh, I only have 2, but my sister who lives in Europe brought her 2 over.
Oh, your sister's in Europe. Wow. Okay. Is she older or younger?
Yeah. She's 3 years younger than me. But the other day, somebody asked us if we were twins, so I'm going with that.
You're all, yes. Is she in good shape like you are?
She's probably in better shape than me. I mean, I was competitive for a bit, and now I also teach yoga. I love yoga,
Oh,
and
nice.
so I've always, for me, like when I first started doing triathlon, my coach, we were talking about my strategy for my first race, and he's an engineer, and my eyes quickly glossed over when he started talking about numbers and splits and all that. And I'm
All
like, I
right.
just want to go as fast as I can and have fun with a smile on my face. So we started calling it smile pacing. So that's what I trademarked smile pacing and started a t-shirt brand, which I have since let go of. But yeah, so that's pretty much my philosophy in life in general is if it's not fun, I really don't want to do it, especially if it's something that's optional, like a sport. And so
Oh, right.
I
Yeah.
stay in shape and I work out. I guess some people would consider pretty hardcore. I don't think so, but my sister is like, she's still pretty competitive and with her daughters too, but I've let that go.
Yeah. Wow, that's amazing. Good for you. Yeah, I always aspire to try to be in better shape, but it just kind of never works out. So I'm just gonna go with that. I'll just
Well,
cheer
you have
you
a
on.
pretty intense job. You've got a lot going on there, so
I do. I
it's
do.
it's hard to put it all in.
Yeah, I'm trying to, I love what you said though. It's like if I'm not enjoying it, I don't want to, do it, especially an optional sport. And the first thing I thought of is, sometimes we have to do work that we don't like, and it's difficult to be
Mm-hmm.
able to, try to make our workplace sometimes a place that we want to show up to. But that's maybe a topic for another time. But what I really love to do is maybe talk to you about, kind of like, how did you get here? Like, what happened? Where were you raised? What was your family like? Maybe we can start with that.
Sure. So I was born in Belgium. My mom was Swedish. My dad is British. And so when I was about 4 years old, we moved. My sister was 1. We moved to the U.S. And then when I was 7 years old, we moved to Mexico City.
Oh my God.
And my dad, it was really cool. My dad works in textiles. And so there's a huge textile industry in Mexico. And so they basically sent us down there because my dad was in sales and marketing and they needed help down there with this company. And it turns out they needed more help. We were supposed to be there for a year or 2. Like, we even rented out our home that we had in New Jersey. My dad was working in Manhattan here in the U.S. And so we rented out our home thinking we were coming back in a year or 2. And they ended up really benefiting from his help down there and needing more. And we loved living there. So we stayed there for 10 years.
Whoa.
And I know. Yeah,
so
it was pretty awesome.
On my mom's side, my mom's from Mexico City, and I have a huge family. I have tons of family out there. Mexico City, people think it does have a little element of danger to it, but it's a very cool city.
Yeah, it's super interesting. The architecture, all the history.
Yeah.
And it's very sophisticated, and so
right.
So we left after my junior year of high school, and my junior year of high school, I had a Mexican boyfriend, and I guess his dad was controversial politically or something, because when he started dating me, the dad said, "You guys need a bodyguard with you." So we had a bodyguard everywhere we went.
Are you serious? Wow, that's intense.
Yeah. And this now I would say it's probably a bit more dangerous.
Wow.
But yeah, even back then, obviously I stood out, like I mentioned before. I'm very blonde. My mom was Swedish, and yeah, I don't need it's my natural hair color, which is really bizarre. Yeah.
I mean, that is a color, so someone's got to have it. Most of us put color in our hair, but no, you're absolutely adorable with you have curly blonde hair, right? And your picture looks like you have blonde hair.
Well, that's because my pictures are all either I just finished sweating out a race or something, or I just got out of the ocean. So there is no picture on Facebook with me having combed hair, I think.
That's awesome. Okay. So
my dad worked in textiles, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom, but she was originally a nurse, and she quit to stay home with the kids and move around the world and be, the executive's wife and entertain and so on. But she also is really entrepreneurial, which I didn't really appreciate until I was an adult. But she's a really talented, she's really talented with knitting and sewing. And so she actually started a business in Mexico where she was designing clothes, and then she hired people to actually make them for her, and really beautiful stuff. I still have some of it. She passed away when my son, my second child, was a month old, but I still have so that was 14 and a half years ago, but I still have a bunch of the stuff she made.
Wow, that is so sad. I'm so glad you have something from her, though. Something that she made. I mean, she must have poured her heart and soul into these pieces. So it's very special that you have that.
Yeah, thanks.
Oh, 1 month old. That's brutal.
Yeah, it definitely was.
Did she get sick?
Yeah, she used to smoke. She was very conscious of her weight ever since a teenager, and I think that's why she started smoking. And because that was before we knew how stupid of a choice that was, and so she started smoking, I think, to control her weight, and then just continued it. And then, but it was never, she smoked like the ultra light Salem, whatever the menthol things, and maybe a couple of days, as far as I can remember at the end. And then she quit, and then 7 years later was diagnosed with cancer, and it was pretty rapid. They I don't think anyone ever told her this, but we knew that she had between 3 and 10 months to live. And then very soon after her diagnosis, I became pregnant. And this was I had had one miscarriage before my daughter, who at this point was 2 and a bit years old. And then I had 2 miscarriages after her. So now I was pregnant again, and having just found out my mom had cancer. So it was a really strange pregnancy, very stressful. My parents were not local, so I was traveling back and forth with my 2-year-old. And so, yeah, my mom was the first person I told, because I found out I was pregnant when I was visiting her. And it was a huge shock, because I had a miscarriage, like a month before or something, 6 weeks before. And so I told her, and I basically said, I have a feeling this is going to be a boy, and you don't have any other grandsons. You only have granddaughters. So you got to hang out and meet him. And sure enough, he ended up being a boy. So we flew down there when he was 6 days old. She met him. We have some pictures, and then she passed away about a month later.
Oh, that is so bittersweet. That's so sad. I'm glad you got to meet your son though.
Yeah.
Wow. That's intense. Were you already sober at that point?
Oh, hell no. That's where things, I think, started to unravel a bit.
Okay.
Because I
was going to just take a step back a little bit and ask you if either of your parents were drinkers.
I don't think there's really any, as far as I know, I don't know that there's any history of alcoholism in my family. There's definitely a history of eating disorders. Pretty much all the women, I think, on my mom's side. But as far as, and I would argue that a lot of it, whether it's addiction, eating disorders, a lot of that stuff really has similar roots.
Oh yeah.
And so, but my mom, I remember her having a wine spritzer where she would have some white wine with a couple of ice cubes and then top it off with seltzer. Like that was, she would have one of those with dinner. And,
is that really even alcohol?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I know. It's like, why bother?
It's why bother, yeah. Clearly not drinking it for effect. Okay, well that's totally normal.
Yeah.
And how old were you when you had your first drink?
I don't know, because it wasn't really a thing. So I grew up, as I said, in Mexico City, and in Mexico, I think there's officially a drinking age, but there really wasn't. It was never enforced that I could tell, and it was very. I remember 6th grade being in people's houses, dance parties, and there was always alcohol around, because a lot of the socializing in Latin cultures, I find, is very intergenerational. And so it's not like here where it's a kids party. So you drop your kids off and then pick them up later. There was very, people were very welcoming to parents coming, and there were always the grandparents were there. So they were drinking. And so there's always alcohol around. And then we would go in high school, they'd have these cocktail parties at nightclubs that were these amazing nightclubs, and you paid a cover to get in, and it was basically open bar. But it never appealed to me. There was, it didn't even really occur to me, which I find so interesting, because when I moved to the U.S. as a senior in high school, I was shocked. That was the biggest culture shock to me, was the way that teenagers here binge drink, and where alcohol in Mexico was, part of the function. Here, I find that whether it's teenagers or adults, it's actually the centerpiece.
Right.
So that was a big shock for me. And so I didn't think, and even drugs, I remember in high school in Mexico, the people who smoked pot or did anything else were considered total losers. Why would you even do that? And so, it didn't even occur to me, quite honestly. So I don't think I didn't really start drinking until probably a little bit freshman year of college, but that's sophomore year of college, because of course that's when I joined a sorority, because that seemed to be the thing to do. And then that's when things started. but even then it was just like what everyone else was doing. I wasn't out of the norm or anything. In fact, there were a lot of people that were doing it a lot worse than me.
Right. Yeah. That's interesting. So your sophomore year in the sorority, when the girls, are they being invited to parties, or are they hosting parties where there's drinking? How did that work?
I would say both, mostly probably the frat parties and going to bars with your fake ID and that sort of thing. And yeah, so I would say that. And it was, and then my junior year of college, I was in France for the year, and there it was definitely a lot of partying, but it was a little different, you know. Again, it was very similar to Mexico, where yeah, there's the alcohol and all that, but it's not the main.
It's not I like you
part
called
of
it
the event.
Yeah, you called it a centerpiece, and that's really how it is, right? Whereas in other areas, it's just part of the ambiance. It's not the main focus.
Right. Yeah, totally. And you know, and now that I'm sober, I really pay attention to that, especially when I travel and I observe other people in my demographic and how are they when they're out. And it's so, I find it very different. You know, it's not, you know, of course it depends on the country. I would say that the UK is definitely on par with the US, probably Ireland. I haven't been there, but other places, like when we were in Spain and France, it was just so different. It was, I hate to say it, but classier. You know?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, when your focus is the alcohol and you're binge drinking, you know, I mean, you don't see a lot of super drunk, classy people. Those aren't words that are typically used in the same sentence, right? So right. That seems fair. People get stupid when a drunk person is not necessarily attractive.
Oh yeah.
Tell me how your drinking evolved from the time that you started. Like typically it's like fun first, and then fun with problems, and then problems in the end.
Yeah. Well, I guess what happened for me was, like I mentioned, it was really stressful time when my mom passed away, and we had moved to Connecticut when my daughter, my oldest, was 2 months old. So when all of this happened with my mom, we'd only been there for like 3 years. And I definitely felt very disconnected, because we moved to a town that's like an hour and a half outside of Manhattan. And I would say most people that live in these little towns, at least in Connecticut, I can't speak for other places, but tend to be from there and be very insular and not particularly, you know, interested in broadening their friend groups and so on. Be very nice and polite, but then that's where it stops. And not welcoming. So I definitely didn't feel, I felt like an outsider, and I'd always sort of, I think throughout my life, felt a bit like an outsider, because even, you know, in Mexico, I wasn't Mexican, and it was glaringly obvious. But in the U.S., I wasn't American. And then when I went to visit my family in Europe, I wasn't European. So I've always felt a little different. And so now in Connecticut, I was definitely disconnected. And so, but, you know, and I had started, like I mentioned before, triathlons and all that when my kids were like 3 and 1. I had started running, and then I started doing triathlons, and that was really great for me, because I broadened my world a bit. Like I finally I was a stay-at-home mom at that point. I had not, when we moved to Connecticut, I didn't have a job to go back to or anything like that. And I had a new baby. So I ended up starting my own photography business out of my home, but it was very part-time. And so I guess I felt disconnected, but I was starting to make friends through the whole triathlon thing, and it was really awesome. And this was before, like right now, everybody and their grandmother's doing a triathlon. This was before all of that. So it felt really badass, you know, like, oh, I'm a triathlete. I don't know any other triathletes here. And so that was cool. And I would say, and it was still like, I don't believe I had I don't even remember how often we drank, but I'm sure it wasn't really that often. And I would say I'm going to do a race that's really important to me in a month, so I'm not going to drink for a month. And it was no big deal.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say it was more, we became friends with other couples that were pretty heavy drinkers, and the guys were, increasingly heavy in their drinking, and I became really uncomfortable with it because at this point I had started my coaching. I had started a triathlon camp for kids every summer. So I was running as the head coach for this. I was doing my sort of like health coaching as a life coach. And so people they now thought of me as somebody who's very health oriented and a role model when it comes to that. And so, at the same time, my kids were getting a bit older. So now they were taking DARE in school and learning about the perils of alcohol and other drugs. And so I started to feel really uncomfortable about the fact that every time we socialized, we were drinking and I had definitely sometimes was drinking a glass of wine on my own while making dinner, where it was just me at home, or it was just me and the kids at home, and so on. And maybe it was more than one glass and so on. So it was definitely starting the quantity and the regularity of my drinking, as far as how often I was drinking, was definitely increasing. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, stress was increasing because my husband he had a new job, and he was traveling to Scotland every other week. And then when he wasn't in Scotland, I know. And then when he wasn't in Scotland, he was in Manhattan, which was a 2-hour commute each way. So, I was just getting really exhausted emotionally and physically. And we were really close to Newtown. We were the next town over, where the Sandy Hook Elementary School shootings happened. And so I was friends with some of the parents who had lost kids, and I was helping out with some of their foundations. And in fact, the triathlon camp that I ran, that I was head coach for in Connecticut, we merged with Race for Chase, we became Race for Chase, which is a kids triathlon program that's now in 26 states, and it's to honor, in 26 locations in 3 states, and it's to honor Chase Kowalski, who was a 6-year-old who was killed in a school shooting. And so, so every time there was a mass shooting somewhere in the country, it was so stressful. It still is. I think most people don't understand that when something like that happens in a community, it has a huge ripple effect throughout the community, and it lasts for years. And so there was just one thing after the other. And then one day I was I felt like such a fraud, here I was, this role model and this, that, and the other. And then telling my kids, these are the dangers of drinking and doing drugs and so on. And I had a couple of times tried to, more than a couple of times, tried to control how often I drank, or how much I drank, that sort of thing. And then I would just start going down the slippery slope again. Mm-hmm. So that was basically, eventually I got to what is now my day one, which was almost over 2.5 years ago. But I basically had a really rough day where I was just exhausted. My self-care had gone down the toilet, and even though I hadn't had anything to drink that day, it was a Sunday, I was just so exhausted, had no more patience for my kids, for my husband, and I was so mean. And that's when I was like, okay, there's so much outside of my control right now, but I feel like drinking has become hugely toxic for me, and I just need to take a break. And that became, I did not know this was going to be my day one, but that became my day one.
Oh, wow. So you just went into it intending to take a break. And that's interesting. So, and
Oh
you've
yeah, because
you've never drank since then?
well, no, and no desire to, because
Oh
so
my God.
I'm
I'm so
like I
sorry.
mentioned before, like when, yeah, so like what I was saying before about how, I loved how feeling like a triathlete was so badass. There's definitely a part of me that's always really, I have an inner rebel. I've always wanted to be a little bit different. Like I know I said I've often felt like a fish out of water, but there's a part of me that actually likes being different and unique. And so all of a sudden, and I was terrified to quit drinking because I had believed what I now recognize as like this massive belief of a complete myth or lie, that I believed that a sober life had to be extremely boring. Like
I know, right?
I was like, oh my gosh, like I'm already, because part of my drinking had been because I wanted to escape the boredom of being basically a suburban mom,
I know. Being a stay-at-home mom is hard, mostly because of the boredom.
Oh my gosh. Oh, well, I remember
about that.
It's so true. I mean, I remember when my kids were really little, just looking at them in complete desperation. One of them was covered in baby food. The other one was on the floor screaming because who knows what little kids scream about. And I remember thinking, I have a master's degree. My husband right now is off on some glamorous trip somewhere in the world. And this is my life. And I have no friends, and my neighbors are cows. It's like,
oh my God.
So total self-pity. Yeah.
I know, but we're laughing about that now. But in the moment, that must have felt so awful.
It is. It's very disconnected. It's very lonely.
Yeah.
And, I didn't mention it, but there were times like even being married, as I know can have its challenges. I always said that my marriage was super easy for me before I had kids. And then it's like, wow. Yeah. And I think, I've sometimes said that having children brings out the worst in me, because it really does. It shows how impatient I can be, how self-centered I can be. And I really recognize that now in sobriety. But I think being a mom, whether you're a working mom, whether you're a stay-at-home mom, there's just like guys can go on with their lives and still, show up and do things with their buddies or play golf or watch golf. And whereas women, it's like, and I'm generalizing, I'm sure that this isn't the case for everyone, but what I've often find for myself, my friends, people I coach, is that we really do, this nurturing thing kicks in, and that's when we feel like we need to hold on to these kids and control as much as we can for them and protect them and nurture them and all that. And we want to do it, but at some point, very often, it's like burnout. It's inevitable unless we have some sort of balance. And I hate the word balance, but
you do? Why?
Because I think it's another one of those myths where we will always fall short, because it is impossible to have a balanced life, and so I think that the way I look at balance is sort of the way that the pediatrician looked at a good diet for my toddler. I remember this. She was like, as long as he has XYZ over the course of 7 days, it's a good diet. And that's what I look at as balance. Like, as long as over the course of a few days, I've managed to somewhat keep my children fed and the house somewhat orderly, and I'm somewhat worked out, and I'm also intellectually engaged and socially engaged and feeling pretty fulfilled, then that to me is balance. But sometimes it has to spread it out over 14 days. I can't do it all in one day.
Right. No, so there is the distinction between perfect balance, which is walking a razor's edge, which is totally unreasonable, right? But there's balance in the way that you described that is, overall balance, right? Because it's so funny. It struck me when you said that, because I feel like the theme of my recovery has been find the balance and recommit. That's kind of how I boil it all down. But the balance for me is really about I kind of wear it like a loose garment, you know, it's not a
Yeah.
razor's edge. Cause you're right. There's no perfect balance at all. Like you can't get balance in an hour or in a day, but you could probably find balance in a week or over a couple
Right.
weeks.
Yeah. Or even over a few months. I mean, I know
Yeah.
like when I'm involved in something, like I mentioned the triathlon camp. So for 6 weeks over the summer, that would be really one of my top priorities, if not my top priority. So during those 6 weeks, I am not training for a marathon. I am not entertaining. I'm really only a good friend if you come and volunteer at my camp. Otherwise, I'll call you in 6 weeks. You know, it's so yeah. So that to me is balance. It's because I can do that in a chunk of 6 weeks. Just like I'm writing a book right now, but honestly, I haven't sat down and written in a few months. But I'm not stressed over it because I know that once this phase I'm in right now, the summer and having all these kids here and all that, when that's done, I will get back to it.
Right. Yeah. That's interesting. So I'm just wondering, like, what's coming up for me as I listen to you is like, you do some things that are, I mean, listen, it's very inspiring to me that you have been able to do things like triathlons, let alone an Ironman. I think that's amazing. And I've observed people who do things like that. They're very focused and very dedicated, which really requires you to be focused and, like, for lack of a better term, out of balance, right? Like most of your energy is and your time is focused on accomplishing something, right? So it does require a lot from you. How are you able to also meet your obligations within the family and take care of yourself while you are striving to achieve these big goals?
Well, my kids have been doing their laundry since they were in 6th grade. But
teaching your kids to be self-sufficient.
I don't micromanage. Yeah, so I mean, I don't micromanage. Even when they were little, I was like, I am not your play pal. I know some people get off on Play-Doh, but I don't. But yeah, so I think it's you know, when I was at one point when my kids were younger, I was in therapy, and my therapist said something really important to me. I was like, oh, I didn't know that. And she basically said that being a stay-at-home mom, a full-time mom, is a relatively new phenomenon if you look at it from an anthropology or historical point of view. And she said that, you know, not too long ago, if you were a full-time mom, you basically had your village around you. You had your extended family helping out. You had, like, it was more of a community. Like, it really did take a village to raise a child, and we don't have that anymore. And so she basically said to me, how you are right now is you're doing so much for the kids and with the kids, and that's really tough. And a lot of women do not find fulfillment in that, and it's okay. Right. And so that was it was a huge revelation to me. And she pretty much with that discussion, those statements sort of gave me permission to just give myself some slack. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, I acknowledge I do not like sitting on the floor playing with little kids. Even back then when my kids were little, I knew that I far prefer hanging out with older kids and teenagers. And now I have teenagers. I can totally vouch for that. And so yes, I think that's part of it is just, I called it training. Like I trained my kids that if I was in my home gym on my treadmill, if the house was not burning down, I did not want to hear from them. And so I was pretty adamant about my self-care and my own space and boundaries. And so I think that's helped. But yeah, I definitely, like, Rich Roll is another podcast I love listening to. And somebody did ask him that, like, some people would, you know, the person that he was actually interviewing said to him, you do all these ultra marathons and races and so on. How can you possibly have balance when your training picks up so much time? And I definitely, I found that an interesting thought, and it resonated with me because I definitely, when I get involved in something, I go all out. Mm-hmm. And so I tend to drop other balls while I'm doing that. But but that's why I don't, like, even when I trained for Ironman, I trained for 10 and a half weeks, which is like, don't do that. Don't even try that. And the only reason I could do that is because I already had a pretty solid base. But most training plans will have you going for 4 to 6 months, or most people actually do Ironman train all year round or most of the year.
Right, yeah.
And I did it in 10 and a half weeks because I know myself. I can do anything really intensely for a short spurt. After that, I get bored. I get, just, it's a drag. And so, so that's sort of the way I operate.
Yeah. So it's that intensity that is, that engages you, right? That's what it sounds like.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. But let's go back to when you decided that you were going to take a break, because I'm very curious how you were able to, what was your process for stopping drinking? Did you participate in any 12-step groups, or how did you get sober? Did you decide, actually, let me ask you this. Did you decide that you were an alcoholic?
Yeah. Oh, hell no. I mean, I knew I had a problem, and yeah, I'll address that in a second. But so basically, I knew that I had an unhealthy relationship with alcohol, but I hate labels, of any kind, because to me, they just seem very defining. As far as, I don't like to label myself because I don't want to define who I am, because that might change tomorrow. And I don't like, maybe part of the aspect of being what's called a third culture child, which is what I was talking about, moving around a bit through the world and having parents from different cultures and so on, is one of the traits is sort of a lack of commitment. And I think I have a fear of permanence, and, I joke about it, but that's one of several reasons I don't have a tattoo, and I probably never will, because it's permanent. And so, unless you want to spend thousands of dollars removing it. But yeah, so what I did was, I basically said, I need to take a break from this. This is one of the things that I know deep down is not serving me, and it's something I can filter out. And I had, at this point, I was pretty deep into yoga. I was teaching yoga, practicing mindfulness, meditating on a regular basis. I had gone through an 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction MBSR course. And so during, I was very aware of how my body felt, I was aware of how my soul felt. And so I just said, you know what, I've known for a while that that alcohol is probably a bad idea. So I'm just going to take a break from it. And I had heard through this guy I met during a mental health training I went through. My cousin had died by suicide a couple of years before. No. And so I got really, I became a facilitator for something called Alternatives Through Suicide. And the guy who hosted it at his yoga studio, he was in recovery, and he told me about SMART recovery, and I'd never heard of that. So, so I it planted a seed, different seeds of sobriety have been planted in my head, and that was one of them. And so when I decided, let me take a break, I also decided this break was going to be different from any other break. This time I was going to look at recovery, active recovery programs and so on. So I went online and joined the SMART Recovery online community, one of the forum for women. And then I ordered the SMART Recovery workbook and started working on those exercises, which is really great. And in that in the forum, somebody mentioned an online group, a Yahoo group. So I joined that, and then through that learned about another podcast, and you've interviewed the host of the Bubble Hour. You've had Jean on. That was such a great interview. Yeah. So that's how I started. Because my quit day was in early December 2015. December 6, 2015 is my sobriety date. And so my kids were going to be home for break and so on. So I didn't actually go to my first 12-step meeting until January when they were back in school. And quite honestly, at that point, I didn't feel like I needed it. I felt like I basically went because it was, and I put this in air quotes, it was research in case some of my coaching clients wanted to learn about it. And so, yeah, so that's how, and I did pick up this book by Jason Vale. I think it's called How to Quit Drinking Easily or something like that. And somebody on Facebook had recommended it because I didn't mention this, but when I was 3 weeks sober, I wrote a blog about my taking a break, or I forget. I should probably go back and read it. But I talked about, having hit some kind of rock bottom with alcohol and that I needed to take a break from it. And I actually published that, and I sat on it for 24 hours because I recognized that if I was this open about all of this, that it was, first of all, everything I post on my blog and so on, I recognize is going to impact my kids, my husband, if somebody reads it. So I have to be aware of that. It's not just me in the world. And then I also recognize that if anyone read this blog, they might recognize that they had a problem and then reach out to me. And I wanted to be sure that I was going to be really careful about my own boundaries and not trying to fix the world because I really need to focus on my own recovery. So once I sat on it, I talked to my husband and he was like, whatever you want to do is fine with me. I support you either way. And so I ended up publishing it. And then somebody who read it, I got so much support and some great messages from people who said, gosh, I totally relate. And then one guy said, I read this book and I haven't had a drink since. So I read the book and
wow.
And it was, it's similar to This Naked Mind by Annie Grace in that it lays out what a poison alcohol is and what a lie we're told by society, and that everything requires alcohol. Otherwise, it's not really a celebration or not really fun or not really stress relief or whatever we're believing. So once I read that, I was like, honestly, I've not wanted to have a drink since. But even so I went to 12 steps and it was good, but you're going to laugh at this. My first couple of meetings, I went to all women's meetings, and my first couple of meetings, I was like, oh my gosh, because I lived in a town that has a huge older population.
Oh,
yeah. And so a lot
I already
of
know what you're going to say.
Women were like in their, yeah. And so a lot of them had
They're
like
older.
20 or 30 years of sobriety. And I'm sitting there thinking, they are still talking about what they did or what happened to them 30 years ago. Yeah. And they're still coming to these meetings. Clearly this program doesn't work. Otherwise they'd be done. Like, who goes to kindergarten for 30 years?
And were they really talking about alcohol?
But I was so curious.
At 30 years sober?
Yeah.
They're talking about alcohol.
There were a couple of them that were, still talking. Oh, yeah.
Oh man,
yeah.
I wish I could.
Yeah, so
be there. That is not my experience. I mean, I still go to meetings and I see there's a lot of women that have, I have 24 years. I never talk about alcohol. It's not about alcohol. It's about all the feelings, managing the feelings that drive the compulsion to drink. But that's hilarious. I'm sorry that was your experience.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Okay.
Yeah, so I didn't go that often, but I kept listening to podcasts. And I would say, I'm so thankful that now we have these podcasts, because especially for women, especially moms who are so busy, and then people who, it didn't really occur to me to be, like, I know a lot of people hesitate to go to any kind of meeting because they're like, oh my gosh, what if I see someone I know? And I always thought how bizarre that thought is. Like, I was like, oh, I hope I see people I know, because I want to know that I actually have sober friends.
Yeah. But you're right. That is a very common thought, though, that people are afraid that they're going to, what if I go and somebody sees me? They don't take the second thought, which is, oh, but they're also there for the same reason.
Right. Yeah. Right. Well, I think it's also with professionals, women that I know who are doctors and lawyers and so on. They're like, what if I see a client or a patient there?
Mm-hmm.
But you know, the way my perspective on that is, quite honestly, what I know now about recovery and all the work that I've done and that I continue to do for myself and other people in the communities, or who are sober curious and so on, is if I were to seek a therapist right now, I would actually want her to be in recovery.
Oh, yeah.
Same thing if I were to seek a new doctor, a primary care provider, I would want her to be in recovery, because just from what I've learned, you know, some of my friends who are in early recovery like me, they go to their doctor, and, you know, one of them recently told me that she went to a new doctor, and the doctor, you know, sat down, asked her all these questions and so on. And then she said, yeah, you know, I've been sober for 2 years or 1.5 years, whatever it's been. And the doctor said, oh, that's great. You know, and so then my friend said, yeah, I've been going to 12-step meetings. And the doctor was like, so how much were you drinking? And so she told her, and the doctor said, don't you think AA is overkill? And,
Wow.
and I'm telling you, there's this lack of awareness and education around alcohol with the medical community and even the mental health community that, to me, when I find out that somebody is in recovery, I just bow down to them, you know, like, and I realize that there's just this, like, we speak the same language.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we do.
And so I have a different level of respect for them.
Yeah, we do speak a different language. So I'm curious though, so you went to a couple of 12-step meetings and it doesn't sound like you really found your place there. Did you find other 12-step? Did you continue with the 12-step program at all, or did you
So what happened is, so I mentioned seeds were planted before I quit drinking. One of the seeds was an acquaintance of mine had posted on Facebook a few years ago, something like, by the grace of God, 4 years sober, or something like that. Just put it out there. And I saw that and I was just so shocked, because for me, somebody who basically was identifying as a problem drinker or an alcoholic, to me that was like, your life must be a train wreck, you know, to get to that point. And part of it was because that's, I think, the general impression that a lot of us naturally have, which I think is one of the downsides of the anonymity in recovery, is that we basically tend to only hear about the extremes and so on. And then and this woman was, you know, totally put together, a mom, seemed like a happy marriage, they had a lot of money and all that kind of stuff. So definitely not, I mean, I was shocked. And so she basically, I reached out to her when I became sober, and she became my sponsor.
Oh.
And so, and I cannot tell you how every day I'm so thankful to her for having had the courage to be open about her recovery in such a way. And then also, she was just an amazing sponsor. And so she took me through the 12 steps, which was so amazing. I mean, I kept thinking throughout it, like, I wish everybody would do this program, you know, whether or not I wrote a blog post several years ago that was something like, everybody is either an addict or an addict in the making, whether it's to food or texting or TV or sex or whatever it is. I really believe we're all potential addicts. And so I think that the 12 steps is just an amazing program for basically self-awareness and for not being such an asshole. And so anyway, sorry, I just swore. But so I found some meetings. So she invited me to some of her favorite meetings, and so I got into that. And then, I definitely became a fan of it. And a lot of it was because, like, one of my favorite meetings, I ended up, some of my friends, they will probably say that it's my fault that they got sober. And so I ended up getting them to this one meeting. And so that became my favorite meeting because all my friends were there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But then I moved like a year ago. I moved from Connecticut. Now we live just outside of DC in Northern Virginia. And I resisted, like, for the longest time. I didn't go to for a couple of months, I didn't go to any meetings here. And part of it was I was just so happy in some ways to be somewhere new where nobody knew me, and I could sort of reinvent myself. And so, and I did have, still doing a lot of work on my recovery. Like, I didn't mention this, but through this online community that I first tapped into, one of the Yahoo groups, I ended up meeting 5 other women, and we formed an accountability group that was all through text.
Oh, I love that.
So there were actually 10 of us to begin with, but we whittled it down to 6 because we determined that we really, like, sobriety had to be our number one priority, and there was going to be no wishy-washiness around it.
Right.
And so a couple of the women were still on the fence and so on. So we basically said, look, we're here. You need to, go do what you need to do. But in the meantime, we were afraid that if you're not committed, it's going to impact the integrity of the group and also maybe facilitate people of relapse and so on. So,
right.
So anyway, so that was 2 years ago. In June, we celebrated 2 years of being this texting group, and we met at She Recovers last year when it was in New York City. Some people flew in because we're spread out all over the country, and so we're like sisters. These women are amazing. And so anyway, so I always have them as my non-face-to-face community, but then eventually I started going to meetings in this area and really have been blown away by the community here. It's very dynamic. I found a couple of meetings I absolutely love and have made some good friends, and it's been a huge blessing for me because moving is so stressful. Moving with teenagers is extremely stressful. And I tell them, when I go to a meeting and if I'm invited to speak, I basically say how thankful I am because I know that no matter where I am, whether it's a move or a travel, I know that I immediately have a place where I can go where people are authentic. There's no bullshit, and you really are, embracing the newcomer.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's beautiful. I'm so glad you had a happy ending with that.
Yeah, for sure.
No, I love how you cultivated all that connection, right? And and you have both kinds, right? So you have like these women all across the country that you can text with, which can be even closer because they're in your hands, right? They're with you at every moment that you can just reach out and stay connected with those women and really share everything. But also the face-to-face community, I think, is so important to have people that you can, they call it, eyeball to eyeball. You can be in someone's presence, like someone's presence and their energy. They can hold safe space for you. I think it feels, different when you see somebody in person, but both are so important. And I just love how you cultivated an environment and a community that supports your recovery. And the one comment I have about the way you all decided to really define the rules, like you need to be really committed to be in this group, and you were able, like, that is such a healthy thing to do, to sort of draw the boundary and say, ask somebody, what side do you want to be on, and that's so brave because that's
right.
I mean, I don't know, most alcoholics I know, or people who struggle with addiction tendencies, have a really hard time with boundaries. And that just seems like such a healthy and brave thing to do. Was that hard to be like, ask them to choose sides?
Well, a couple of the women, they actually decided it for themselves. They realized they weren't ready. One of the women was actually, we could tell when she was drinking. And then one night she texted us and said, forget it. I'm blah, blah, blah. And she was at this point, she's like, I'm already hammered and now I don't care anymore. I'm going to go get in my car and drive somewhere. And I did not sleep all night because at this point, like I don't think we even knew her last name. We just knew what city she was in. We didn't know her license plate.
Right.
And I didn't sleep because I was terrified that this woman was going out and going to kill someone or kill herself. And so the next day, we all decided that that's it. She'd done this pulled this sort of thing too many times, and we couldn't do it. And so, but it is hard because, and I think that's why, if anyone's going to try and mimic what we've done here, which we've often thought that, like, wouldn't it be so cool if we, had something that could be replicated, because it's been incredibly powerful for us. Like we know everything about each other. We send now and then, I'll record a video of myself talking to them and then post it in the group chat. So it's like you're seeing somebody every day and learning about their lives. And so it's very intimate. And then, but we still have to step back now and then because we are all so different and from different walks of life. And so, maybe have different political views in different socioeconomic brackets. Our marriages are different and so on. So it's always a fine line, but it's been a very, I think, powerful way to learn how to connect in a respectful, loving way with other women, which,
right.
You mentioned boundaries in general, but I find also it's really hard sometimes to just have really good relationships with other females can be challenging.
It can. Yeah. We're taught to compete against each other, but like the whole premise of She Recovers is that we're stronger together, which I love.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I know you have people coming to visit you soon, so I want to be respectful of your time. But my typical, and listen, thank you so much for coming on. I learned a lot about you, and I really appreciate, how much you were able to share and your transparency regarding 12-step programs. I know some people can be like super fanatical about it, and I appreciate your openness and your honesty and how that your experience with that program evolved and how you got to the place where you are today. So I'm really grateful you were able to share all that. But typically what I do to wrap up the conversation is to ask, because the podcast is, owed out one day at a time, do you have like a daily, weekly, or monthly routine to help you stay sober one day at a time?
I guess it's things that I do and things that I don't do. So my first year of sobriety, I said, sobriety first is my mantra. And I also said, so that means if something does not truly, if I don't feel passionate about something, if I don't truly enjoy being around somebody, if something just doesn't make me sparkle, and then I will say no to it. And so, like yesterday, I was teaching a private lesson, yoga, and I was telling my client, I'm like, just know it, like N-O, just know it. And so I'm pretty selective of how and with whom I spend my time with, because it's so precious. And so I'd say that's one thing I do on a regular basis. I'm not going to be the person baking for the school bake sale, because that doesn't excite me. But on the other hand, this morning I did volunteer to take photos at my son's swim meet, because I love taking photos of kids, and candids. So, and then I exercise pretty much every day. I do something. I either go for a run, I do yoga, I meditate pretty much every day too, either using the Insight timer, using a guided meditation, or I just sit on my own. I also consider moving, even walking or running can be a meditation. And so sometimes I'll do that. So basically the way that you run and meditate is breathe. When I take I breath in, I count how many steps that took. And when I breathe out, I count the steps. And if I can hold that focus, then, that's part of my mindfulness practice. Other than that, I would say I read every single day. I read something. I'm not a fiction reader because I don't know, I haven't read fiction in years unless it's one of my children. My son will insist I read something that he just read. So then I'll read
so
one
cute.
of his books, but I'll either read something related. I know, he's so cute. So, but I'll read something that's either related to sobriety, you just had Anna David on. So her new book, the one with Hal Elrod, The Miracle Morning. So I just actually got that. So I'm probably going to start that soon.
Oh, yay.
But right now I'm reading a Tony Robbins book, and I'm almost done with that. And then I'll read Anna David's Hal Elrod's book. But yes, I'm always reading something like that every single day right before bed. And I know that one of my primal needs in life, which is if I don't meet it, I end up in trouble, is authentic connection with another human being. And so in a way that feels, fulfilling, like you had mentioned it earlier, and I never answered you really. You said, do you consider yourself an alcoholic? And my problem with that is, I think, the stigma related to that word. And also I'm really, for years and years, I've been interested in personal development and neuroscience. And so I recognize the importance of words and ideas. And so just like if I was today diagnosed with cancer, I wouldn't say I am cancer or I am cancerous. And then if I went into remission, for whatever reason, it left my body, or at least seemed to leave my body, I would not say I am cancerous. I would probably say I'm a survivor or I had cancer. And I think it's really important the way that I think of myself to myself, because it's very easy to, even on a very subconscious level, start to filter out certain things in the world and in my life and in other people based on my interpretation of who I am and how I am. And so when I go to meetings, I identify myself as an alcoholic, but quite honestly, I would prefer not to do so. So I haven't gotten around to it, but I know I can say I'm in recovery and blah, blah, but just for sake of simplicity, I just say I'm an alcoholic.
Yeah.
But I believe that, if I were to really say what I am, I would say, I actually made a t-shirt for myself that says I'm thriving in sobriety, because that's the way I think of it.
Oh, I love
and so
that.
Yeah. So I guess that's the I take care of my nutrition. I'm big on whole foods. I'm plant-based. So I would say, and I definitely have a spiritual practice. I know a lot of people struggle with a God and higher power, might have trauma related to religion. I don't have trauma related to it. I definitely did not have a structured religious upbringing, but and I've gone through periods in my life, especially when my mom died, where I questioned the existence of God. Where is my mom? Was she in some, is that it? And then certain things happened after my mom's death where there's no way they could have been coincidences. At least somebody said in a meeting, by the way, recently, a little while back, I heard them say that coincidences are God's way of staying anonymous. And I thought that really resonated, because that's how I felt with what happened after my mom died on a few occasions. And so
can you elaborate on what happened to make you feel like that was like a little God moment?
Sure. I think so. There were a couple things. One of the main ones being when I was in the depths of despair, of feeling completely untethered, the way I think we often feel when we lose a parent. I felt like I said, I did not know if there was anything else out there. Where is that it? Like, that's it for my mom. And it was very disorienting. And so one night I had a dream that I was sitting in a kitchen, and it wasn't my kitchen. I have no idea what kitchen it was, but I was sitting in the kitchen and I was just so sad. And I was sitting there at this kitchen table crying. And then my mom came to me and she put her arms around me and she hugged me and she said, Suzanne, it's okay. Everything is okay and it's going to be okay. And it was, it was so realistic. And then I woke up knowing that had happened. And but the weirder thing is that I then went into my daughter's room, and she was like 3.5 or something. And so my mom was Swedish, and in Sweden you call the grandmother, so the mother's mother is mormor, which means mother's mother. So my kids, my daughter called her Momo. And so I went into my daughter's room. She'd just woken up and she looked at me and she goes, Mommy, Momo came to me last night. She said, everything's going to be okay.
Oh my God.
Right? I know.
Oh
weird.
my God. That's amazing.
Yeah. So it was that. There were a couple of other similar things that I won't go into, but I just like my son, every time, because he was a month old when she died. And during that first year, every time he hit a milestone in his development was on a day that would have been important to my mom. Like it would have been her birthday or, things like that. And so I just felt really connected to my mom. And so I knew there was something else out there.
Yeah. It's, and that knowing it hits you like in the deepest part of your heart and your soul. Right. Yeah. That's beautiful. Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. That made me cry. That's a beautiful thing.
Oh,
that's so amazing.
Oh, thanks for asking.
Yeah. Well, listen, how do people, I know you do coaching. How do people get a hold of you if they would like to work with you?
So my website is therebootcoach.net. And so that's probably the easiest way. I'm also on Instagram. My account is mindfulprenure, like entrepreneur, but mindfulpreneur. So I'd say those are probably the two best ways. And yeah, I love coaching. I mean, I'm a life coach. I'm also a certified recovery coach. I'm a certified triathlon coach and teach yoga. And,
wow.
And so a lot of,
I
love
teacher.
Involving the body. And I've always been a teacher. I love teaching and I joke about it, but seriously, like if I want to learn something more or get better at it, then I teach it.
Yeah, I totally get that. That was like one of the covenants of the Stephen Covey principles. If you want to really learn something, teach it to somebody else. It's very cool.
That's so true.
Well, I will certainly leave links to all of these things, your website and your Instagram and all that, so that people can, reach out and say hello and get to know you a little better and potentially work with you. But I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to share your story with us. And I am so excited to meet you in person in September.
Oh my gosh. Well, it's such an honor being here because, like I said, I love listening to your podcast and I feel like you interview people that I super duper admire. And of course you too. So it's really an honor to be here. Thank you. And I can't wait to meet you.
I know we're going to have so much fun. Yeah. That'll be great. Well, listen, I hope you have a wonderful day and I will look forward to seeing you soon.
All right. Thank you, Arlena. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye. One last thing before you go, if you enjoyed the podcast today, please don't forget to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher and leave a review. And if you'd like to make a donation to the podcast and help me keep the lights on, you can do so by visiting odatchat.com. There's a donation button or membership button on the right-hand side. Have a great day. Thank you so much for joining us.